Chapter 3:1. Up until this point, we have investigated the various questions that surround the money form, but we must now ask why these questions play such an important role for the totality of capital. Of course, we cannot simply speak of the entirety of capital. But Marxian economists often treat the theory of the value form as a portion of the text that merely gives proof for the necessity of money. Yet the theory of the value form itself is precisely what clarifies the secret of capital, a theoretical analysis capable of elucidating the foundations of capital as a whole, even without the supposition of labor time. The idea that the value of a commodity is based on the labor contained within it has existed since the work of William Petty. In Adam Smith, this concept is grasped quantitatively as labor time, but such a concept only becomes possible with the establishment of mechanical production, in which the individual and qualitative differences of labor are erased. But, in Smith, this epochal discovery still does not lead him to be able to clarify how such labor time applies to products produced by means of non-mechanical production. To put it another way, Smith was never able to make clear why it is that the capitalist system, based on mechanical production, spreads across the landscape of all production, including non-commodity production, becoming capable of organizing the entirety of this space within capitalist society. Every product passes through the money form, and is thereby attributed the same external appearance as those produced mechanically. Although mechanical production is merely one aspect of the totality of production, it is what gives all production the external appearance of the form of the capitalist system. Thus, in order to explicate the nature of capitalist society, we must inquire into the origins of the money form, which is the condition of possibility for this aspect. And even if Marx adopted the theory of labor time from classical political economy, he problematized the riddle that precedes it theoretically. Circulation bursts through all restrictions as to time, place, and individuals, imposed by direct barter, and this it effects by splitting up, into the antithesis of a sale and a purchase, the direct identity that in barter does exist between the alienation of one's own and the acquisition of some other man's product. What Marx means here in terms of money is precisely the letter, or script. For example, in spoken language, there must be a listener. If the other party in conversation says the word dog, we can ascertain what type of dog they mean. But, if the word dog is written, we do not know what type of dog is intended. Unlike conversation, script can be read anywhere and at any time. The direct identity of speaking and listening is split up by the letter or script. But, if we were to problematize Marx's way of writing, it appears as if direct exchange existed at the very beginning, which is then followed by a sort of mediated exchange. Perhaps this is indeed the proper sequence. First we speak, then we learn to write. However, what we should be wary of here is that this ordering parallels exactly the notion that there is from the outset an interiority that later comes to be exteriorized. Why do we write at all? Because we possess something that in the end cannot be fully satisfied solely by speaking. This is precisely what people call interiority. A child who is not yet literate does not have this sort of interiority, it is the result of script or letters. Nevertheless, people equally conceive of script as if it were the thing most estranged from interiority. The reason for this is that script is generally phonetic script, and is thus frequently seen to be simply the expression of phonemes. Thus, we must try to conceive of money, phonetic script not from the standpoint of interiority or the value that inheres in the commodity, but from the standpoint of what Marx understood as the value form as hieroglyphic. It is not that script was invented to express some transcendental meaning or value. On the contrary, it was precisely script that brought about these things. This fact itself is concealed within the form of consciousness that is the result of the establishment of money, phonetic script. In general, conceptions of money are metaphysical insofar as they are transfixed by the concept of money merely as the measure of value. Certainly, Ch3 was no exception to this. However, what allowed him to take language as the value form, in other words, as a relation of difference of the signifier, is precisely that he was able to avoid all such conventional wisdom in relation to the concept of language itself. But when it comes to thinking the similarity of money to language, what dominates Ch3's understanding is the old and entrenched prejudice haunting the history of Western thought. For instance, Ch3 eliminates the analysis of any other script systems, such as Chinese characters, limiting his discussion to alphabets or phonographic script. However, this is because he sees script as something that expresses phonemes, rendering it secondary, a conception already prevalent since Plato. This is just the same as the conception of money as the manifestation of the value of the commodity or its measure. Classical political economy treated money as secondary by means of the labor theory of value. Thus, money becomes something superfluous, and it is from here that the conception of money as the root of all evil is derived. In fact, Proudhon, basing himself on classical political economy, advocated the elimination of money and proposed a theory of labor money. Generally speaking, those ideologues who abhor money have some sort of direct exchange in mind. Just as Plato and Rousseau abhorred script, they think as if there were the possibility of a sort of internal, direct exchange as communication. However, what is direct or internal is itself a product of money, phonetic script, and in the perversion of this perspectival approach is precisely a metaphysics. In this schema of money form equals phonetic script equals consciousness, the value form is always already concealed. But why is this important at all? Because, despite the fact that this characteristic of money is the foundation of the transformation of money into capital, this aspect of it is simultaneously hidden. If money were merely something that expressed the value of a commodity, the M, money, C, commodity, M plus delta M, process would be impossible. In other words, without the possessor of money, who purchases a commodity, and through selling it gains delta M, surplus value, the emergence of capital itself would be impossible. However, where there is money, there is bound to be merchant capital. This is not because humans characteristically seek profits or anything of the kind. Precisely only at the point when the necessary foundations through which exchange generates profits, surplus value, are in place can any such sort of human nature emerge at all. For the time being, whether we examine the process from MC or CM, there is no scope for the generation of surplus, except by fraud. But temporary fraud is incapable of producing the continuous foundations of capital, self-expanding money. The key is that in fact such foundations can only emerge insofar as MC and CM are uncoupled or de-linked in terms of both time and place. In other words, money is not a simple value measure that expresses value, but is rather nothing more than what we might call an opaque text. Marx sees the general possibility of crisis in this type of separation, but the conditions of possibility of crisis and the conditions of possibility of capital itself are located at the same point. To put it simply, merchant capital arises from buying something cheaply in one region and selling it for more in another region. However, the merchant is not a swindler, nor is the merchant practicing a form of unequal exchange. The value of one commodity is not immanent, but exists simply through its value relation with all other commodities. But, once it takes the money form, it comes to be expressed quantitatively. The same commodity is cheap in one place and expensive in another simply because the relations between different commodities are themselves different from place to place. When these relations are erased by the money form, it appears exactly as if there were an independent, immanent value. Thus, the differential as system of relation appears as quantitative difference by means of money. That the same commodity is cheap in one place and expensive in another rests on the fact that value is not immanent in it, but merely present in a system of differential relations. Then, when it is transformed quantitatively by means of money, this difference as system appears as the price differential of a single commodity. Merchant capital depends on this price differential. In order for this to be the case, these two systems of value must be mutually isolated. Consequently, merchant capital can only exist in the interval between mutually distant, differing systems. The trading peoples of antiquity, like the gods of Epicurus, are located in the intermundia, in the spaces between the worlds, or rather like the Jews in the pores of Polish society. 3. Of course, this is by no means exclusive to the trading peoples. For instance, Sakamoto Ryama recognized price differentials between Nagasaki, Shimonoseki, and Osaka, and organized commercial shipping to exploit this gap. But what rendered this possible was that those regions were fully separate and possessed different value systems. Paul Valéry writes as follows: "After all, a work of art is an object, a human product, made with a view to affecting certain individuals in a certain way." Works of art are either objects in the material sense of the term, or sequences of acts, as in the case of drama or the dance, or else summations of successive impressions that are also produced by acts, as in music. We may attempt to define our notion of art by an analysis based on these objects, which may be taken as the only positive elements in our investigations, considering these objects and progressing on the one hand to their authors and on the other hand to those whom they affect. We find that the phenomenon of art can be represented by two quite distinct transformations. We have here the same relation as that which prevails in economics between production and consumption. What is extremely important is to note that these two transformations, the author's modification of the manufactured object and the change which the object or work brings about in the consumer, are quite independent. It follows that we should always consider them separately. Any proposition involving all three terms, an author, a work, a spectator or listener, is meaningless, for you will never find all three terms united in observation. I shall go further, and here I come to a point you will no doubt find strange and paradoxical, if you have not come to that conclusion about what I have already said, art as a value, for basically, we are studying the problem of value, depends essentially on this non-identification, this need for an intermediary between producer and consumer. It is essential that there should be something irreducible between them, that there should be no direct communication, and that the work, the medium, should not give the person it affects anything that can be reduced to an idea of the author's person and thinking. There will never be any accurate way of comparing what has happened in the two minds of author, artist and other or reader, and moreover, if what has happened in the one were communicated directly to the other, all art would collapse, all the effects of art would disappear. The whole effect of art, the effort that the author's work demands of the consumer, would be impossible without the interposition, between the author and his audience, of a new and impenetrable element capable of acting upon other men's being. For thus, Valéry seeks the ultimate foundation of the value of the work in the fact that the two transformations are mutually severed from each other and opaque. What he directly criticizes is the Hegelian conception of aesthetics. That is, Hegel's aesthetics, like the aesthetic theories of Marxism, locates itself in a position from which it can observe these two transformations at the same time, turning history into something transparent. What Valéry here calls value corresponds to what Marx conceives of as surplus value. Just as Valéry's reflections concern the written work or text, When we think of surplus value, we must remain aware of the correspondence between money and phonetic script. For example, Saussure thought language in its similarities to money, but, just as he erased the problem of script from his theory of language, he was only able to theorize money as a simple measure of value. In other words, any attempt to relegate the equation of money script to a secondary phenomenon, whether in economics or in linguistics, will inevitably be led into a shared error. When we have the process of commodity C money M commodity C, Saussure would see this as message taking code to signify language, langue. Talcott Parsons, who attempted to apply linguistics to the economic sphere, conceived of money as a form of code. But he began from the point that Saussure had not fundamentally understood what money was. If, for example, the circulation process CMC was what Saussure thought, then it is not possible that it should also be its inverse or verso, the process MCM, M plus delta M. A linguist would postulate here the ideal speaker-hearer. However, it is not that this idealized, clear communication becomes unclear due to the mediation of script. Rather, in precisely the inverse sense, it is that clear communication, exchange, itself is nothing more than a metaphysical abstraction born from phonetic script or money. Roman Jakobson optimistically spoke of installing linguistics as the foundation of its proximate sciences, but in reality what must be called into question is the origin of linguistics itself. 3. In contrast to the merchant who gains profit from the circulation process, the religious leader or philosopher would typically have seen in such a process an example of unequal exchange, or moral injustice. But the conception of equal exchange is itself a metaphysics that posits in thought an inherent value to the commodity, corresponding to the disdain the philosophers had for the mediation and lower secondary category of writing or script. Marx gives little consideration to merchant capital, the most ancient form of capital's existence, the form of capital born from the MCM process of circulation. When he speaks of the transformation of money into capital, Marx dismisses the consideration of merchant capital because, for him, what was crucial was to speak of the secrets of industrial capital, and, in order to do so, it was necessary to negate the illusion posited by merchant capital, the illusion that it is the circulation process that gives rise to surplus value. On this point, he was influenced by the attitude of classical political economy, which emerged in opposition to the theorists of mercantilism. It is true, commodities may be sold at prices deviating from their values, but these deviations are to be considered as infractions of the laws of the exchange of commodities, which in its normal state is an exchange of equivalents. Consequently, no method for increasing value, the creation of surplus value, and therefore the conversion of money into capital, can consequently be explained neither on the assumption that commodities are sold above their value, nor that they are bought below their value. The capitalist class, as a whole, in any country, cannot overreach themselves. Turn and twist then as we may, the fact remains unaltered. If equivalents are exchanged, no surplus value results, and if non-equivalents are exchanged, still no surplus value. Circulation, or the exchange of commodities, begets no value. 5. In the broad sense, there should be nothing beyond commodity exchange able to give rise to surplus value. The production process, too, must be thought within the questions of exchange between the possessors of commodities. It appears that Marx is saying that industrial capital gains surplus value not from the circulation process, but from the production process. However, the production process itself has no relation to value, and value, indeed surplus value too, is something that only arises through the exchange process. In fact, as will later be discussed, industrial capital depends on the margin, surplus value, that exists in the process of the purchasing of the commodity called labor power and the selling of the commodity thereby produced. Thus, consideration of merchant capital discloses the characteristics of capital in general. Exchange, buying and selling, is always formed through an agreement or consent between two parties. In principle, unless there is an equality between what is exchanged, exchange itself, buying and selling, does not emerge. Exchange must be seen, at least by the exchangers themselves, as equal. Yet, originally, the distinction between equal exchange and unequal exchange became possible only at the moment when the inherent value of a single commodity was considered. When exchange takes place above or below the inherent value of a single commodity, it is unequal exchange. However, what we are treating here as the inherent value of a commodity can itself only be posited at precisely the moment when two mutually distinct systems of value relation come to be thought. The value of a commodity in a single system is simply a relative value determined by multiple relations, and, in this sense, the distinction between equal and unequal exchange is meaningless. Thus, exchange in the interior of this system would never give rise to surplus value. This is what Marx means when he writes, above, the capitalist class, as a whole, in any country, cannot overreach themselves. Consequently, it is only through the mediation between two differing systems that the existence of unequal exchange or surplus value first becomes a necessity. For Saussure destroyed meaning when he grasped language as the value form. Yet, on the other hand, he speaks of the value of language, not its meaning. For example, the words Ch3 and Arba share a meaning, but, within each of their respective systems, they hold different relations to other words. This is the point at which their value differs. But what Saussure is truly saying is the following. Language in general does not exist anywhere. One langue, itself a differential system, exists in contrast to another langue. That is, he rejects the myth of Babel, that, until that point, language had been one. This is because the myth of Babel is one logical product of monotheism, in other words, world money. For example, Plato pointed out the arbitrariness or ambiguity of the relation between the conceptual and the phonetic, since a concept can be expressed differently in Greek and other languages. What Saussure would eventually call the arbitrariness of the sign has been often understood in this way, but it indicates something quite different. For Plato, the concept exists as something translatable between various national languages, just like money in the commercial world of the Mediterranean in his time. When Saussure uses the term arbitrariness, he emphasizes, rather, that each language simply existed from the outset as phonetic difference, and that there is no such thing as a concept that would exceed it. Marx writes as follows, on the other hand, as I have before remarked, the exchange of products springs up at the points where different families, tribes, communities, come in contact, for, in the beginning of civilization, it is not private individuals but families, tribes, and that meet on an independent footing. Different communities find different means of production, and different means of subsistence in their natural environment. Hence, their modes of production, and of living, and their products are different. It is this spontaneously developed difference which, when different communities come in contact, calls forth the mutual exchange of products, and the consequent gradual conversion of those products into commodities. Exchange does not create the differences between the spheres of production, but brings what are already different into relation, and thus converts them into more or less interdependent branches of the collective production of an enlarged society. 6. In other words, what is presupposed is the coexistence of differential systems. The system is something fundamentally for others or with others, taiteki na mano. 7. The state exists as the state only in relation to other states. Philosophers often bring up the concept of intersubjectivity, or collective subjectivity. Culture, for example, is precisely a form of collective subjectivity, and perception itself will differ on the basis of culture. But, in the present context, we would say that a collective subjectivity constitutes a system or institution, thus presupposing other collective subjectivities as its own precondition, and that there exists in a sense no truly collective subjectivity capable of collectively overcoming all of these. Or rather, what makes it seem that there is indeed such a truly collective subject is world money, which gives rise in the religious context to world religion. World money, in this sense, perfectly conceals or covers over the more essential heterogeneity. At this point, we ought to also think the concept of number. As Marx argues, the general form of value or the money form makes possible the qualitative identity and quantitative proportionality of various commodities. This is precisely the level on which number comes to exist, appearing when it abstracts from qualitative difference and renders it into an identity. Consequently, number too conceals the form of value. For Nietzsche, who radically theorized the suppression of heterogeneity, this could not be overlooked. Logic itself rests upon assumptions to which nothing in the world of reality corresponds. For example, the correspondence of certain things to one another and the identity of those things at different periods of time are assumptions pure and simple, but the science of logic originated in the positive belief that they were not assumptions at all but established facts. It is the same with the science of mathematics, which certainly would never have come into existence if mankind had known from the beginning that in all nature there is no perfectly straight line, no true circle, no standard of measurement. 8. In other words, the expression of quantitative proportionality emerges through the concealment of the value form. The value of one commodity in a given system only exists in a relation of value with the other commodities in the system, but when given expression by means of money, it appears quantitatively, as price. The merchant capitalist buys commodities at this price and takes them to another system. There, the commodities are placed into a different relation of value, appearing at a price higher than before. Thus, MCM, M plus delta M, becomes possible only by means of the differential in value relations between two systems. Thus, despite the fact that both CM and MC, which constitute the surface of the MCM process, exist as forms of equal exchange, surplus value nevertheless emerges. Chapter 4:1